All right, we are now live. We're going to give people a few minutes to tap in, to join in. I am very excited for this author chat. So, our August read was The Prophets um, by Robert Jones Jr., also known as Son of Baldwin. You have been doing a lot of great work online in the digital space for so long. So I'm so happy that you wrote this book and that we had an opportunity to read it in the SBG Book Club. You know, our work is really focused around making reading accessible and pushing back against dis and misinformation in the Black digital landscape. And as a full-time YouTuber, there's this like anti-intellectual movement happening that's homophobic, transphobic, all that. And I think this is a read that really helps you to broaden your viewpoint. Um, I'm probably in this interview going to reference that we also read Hortense Spiller's. And so now I'm always thinking, where did you get that from? You know, when you think about the language, where did you get that from? And this book, The Prophets, definitely makes you think about where we got some of these things from and how rooted in trauma and white supremacy and the plantation they are. So
Yes.
we are really happy to have you here. And
Thank you so much for having me.
we see some of the books that we've read or we're going to read in the book club in the background. So we're definitely supporting. We had Kiese last August. So
Hey,
this is the anniversary. We're going to have another great discussion. And we had all the questions submitted by the community. So we won't be taking any live questions, but this will be a great discussion. And we're just going to go ahead and get into the questions.
okay.
So to start off, the prophets in the chapters and characters in the book are largely named after Christian biblical references. And you are we right or wrong that you grew up in a household with a parent that was Southern Baptist and a parent that was Nation of Islam?
That is correct.
So were there any Islamic references or Nation of Islam references in the book that maybe we missed because we tend to be a little, well, Judeo-Christian centric in our language?
You know, at first I thought, I don't think so. But then I remembered that there is a direct Nation of Islam influence in the chapter Chronicles, where you have the ancestral voices speaking. At the end of that chapter, it's a very short chapter, the voices tell a story of an unnamed person who did something forbidden. And that's an allusion to the story of Yaqub. I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of Yaqub, who was said to be this brilliant black scientist in the ancient times who was responsible for the creation of the white race. That he did some forbidden experiments that eventually created what we now know as white people. And that is something that the Nation of Islam, it's a part of their religious spiritual belief system. And so there is a small reference to that in the prophets.
Um, what made it important to include the biblical references? A lot are all the chapters sort of named after biblical references, or and it almost feels like all the characters also have biblical names.
Just about all of the chapters are named after biblical, either actual books in the Bible, books that have been left out of the Bible, or sort of biblical concepts. And yes, most of the characters also are named, have Christian names. And that was very intentional because part of the work of the prophets is to look at Christianity from a critical lens, to see the ways in which our indoctrination as enslaved Black people, as the descendants of enslaved Black people, that Christianity was part of the sort of project to subjugate us. It was a way to split us from our previous understandings of existence, nature, love, relationships, sex, so on and so forth. Christianity, while used as a sort of support system for a lot of Black people, its origins are, I would say, troubling. And I wanted to sort of look at it from a different perspective this time rather than from the common one, which is that Christianity helped us get through a lot of things. And yes, it did, but it also disturbed a lot of things and destroyed a lot of things.
When I was reading the prophets, the themes and sort of kind of underlining commentary that the book gives on having us look back or think through what how Christianity came to be and how it was used against us, how we've come to it, and the trauma that it's caused was we read Freshwater by Akweke Imizi,
Mm,
which she has, oh, well, they, sorry, not to misgender them, they have a pretty strong character that is like a reference to Jesus. And it's really crafty in the story how they note how, yes, Christianity can be the thing that got you through, that sort of love that the Bible talks about with Jesus and the congregation can be something that does hold you through, but it's also something that harms. And there was actually a lot of themes that I saw parallel to Freshwater because the book is literally about a character's mind splintering and different rooms
mm.
happening. And so we get Sarah and Bianti, who we'll talk about later. Bianti stirred a lot of emotion in the book club. There was a lot of thoughts about Bianti, or AKA Malua, and what they were really up to. um, would you classify the spiritual aspects of the book as magic realism?
um, I suppose if they have to be categorized, they would probably fall into what literary circles refer to as magical realism. But for me, it was just a normal expression of the way I understand blackness, the way that I was raised in blackness, where there is a very thin line between the here and the hereafter, the mind and the spirit, the body and the heavens. So for me, it was just an articulation of a particular kind of worldview that to me is just the way we exist, the way nature exists. But I suppose if you are not from that tradition, it could seem like something that is, I guess, magical or mystical in its nature. But for me, it's really simply me speaking in the voices of the people I come from.
Yeah, so when I think of magic realism, I don't think so much that it implies that it's magic, it's inherently magical. So I think the term is also like often applied to like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's style of writing, which
Hmm.
it's sort of like the magic is in the person, but it's still kind of written in this way in which it seems slightly otherworldly, even though it's really rooted in this realism. So like we're on empty, and there's a scene later in the book where the women come together, and there it does feel like well, for me I read it as like our culture and our tenacity and our ability to survive when the only guarantee is death is is magic the right word? I don't know that language is expansive enough to express what that really means and how valuable that is to us. But it does, I guess, if we were to classify it, the closest thing we get is magic realism.
I that scene in particular to me, I would not use the word otherworldly. I would say innerworldly. And that is what I was trying to do with each and every one of these characters, even the white ones, was to articulate this inner world in a way that language sometimes cannot capture. And so I did have to get somewhat poetic in the descriptions in order to make real or make seen these inner worldly things.
Appreciate that. Well, we'll get more into that scene later on. So would love to talk about the research process. Because even these short few minutes hearing you talk about the biblical references and the other references that you pulled in the book and the layering of the characters in interviews you have discussed that this book took several years in the making. And so I would love to know what your research process looked like, because I would classify this as like very similar to Toni Morrison's Beloved. It's a historical fiction that goes between a plantation in Mississippi, the kingdom of Kasango, and then the ocean between them. And so how did you go about writing this book? What kind of research did you dig in to pull all these references?
Well, it begins, of course, with the Bible, something that I had become intimately familiar with because of my upbringing, and because of the ways I felt oppressed by some of the biblical laws and interpretations and such. So I begin there, but the rest come from basically my joy in reading Black works. So I didn't know until I was about 16 years old, and I know how ridiculous this is going to sound. Reading Terry McMillan's Mama, that I could write a book about my mundane little life in the projects. Somebody wants to know about it because I thought your life had to be super big and super important for you to write about, because you always see these epic white novels by white authors and these grand beautiful lives of wealth and inheritance, and I didn't have any of that. I was this little queer boy in the projects, trying to figure things out, reading Terry McMillan, realizing, wow, I can actually write about my life. So, long story short, I get to college as an older adult. I didn't go back to college until I was 31, and I took Africana Studies as a minor, creative writing as a major. And so, my minor, I'm exposed to all of these great works, Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin and Wallace Thurman. And I'm reading all of these things, and I cannot find the Black queer character until the Harlem Renaissance. Wallace Thurman is writing in 1929. And so my question was, well, where is the Black queer person? Because they don't just pop out of nowhere. Um, and that led me to reading as much work as I possibly could within the Black diaspora to find where the Black queer character was. And I largely could not find them. There's a reference in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. There's a reference in Beloved by Toni Morrison, but both of those are under the context of rape. And I was looking for love. And so, where I find these things actually are in the oral histories of continental Africans, such as Esther Arma talking about her tribes in Ghana and how queerness was a normal part of the landscape, that there was no such thing as separating it or regarding it as sinful until Christianity shows up and the Christian missionaries teach that. So it was a long process of reading lots of Black fiction, lots of sociological and anthropological works by sociologists and anthropologists, and listening to the oral histories of African scholars who were honest about their personal histories and their cultural histories.
That sounds like a very intensive process. And it's funny, so you went back to school as an older adult. Today's my first day of graduate school. I am 36. I'm actually going to be late to my class for this author chat, but it's all good. And it's actually a class about Black history prior to 1865.
Oh,
So
wow.
maybe I'll also go looking for some of these queer narratives, because in the book club next month we are doing Wayward Lives by Sadia Hartman. So we're
Oh,
gonna be
wow.
exploring more. We're gonna keep on keeping on. We try to build upon
Yeah.
the themes. All right. So obviously you had a very intense research process. Now when you get to the writing, you have a lot of complex characters that have, for a first time novel, a lot of your characters have very full story arcs. There's
Mm.
some back history, there's the current history, then there's kind of where they're at in the ending. It seems like it's a very layered book. So how did you manage to include so many points of views and write such complete story arcs for so many characters?
Initially, this book was only going to be told from the perspective of Isaiah. Um, And then I realized how small his perspective was. It could not give me the scope and the grandeur that I was hoping to capture. So I decided that Samuel would also have a part, and they would be speaking back and forth to one another while conveying this story. But then that too seemed a little bit limiting until I had this epiphany that really what was the um, heart of this story was their love, and that love needed witnesses. So what it became from that point was um, an intense discussion with myself about how I could allow other characters on this plantation tell us about this love between Samuel and Isaiah, whether they were saying good things about it, whether they were ignoring it, whether they thought it was disgusting. What could they tell us about this love? And I had to then allow them in to me to tell me their stories so that I could articulate it as truthfully as I possibly could, without interfering too much as the author. And so, years and years of writing that, over and over and over again, revising and revising and revising, till I get to this point where I realize, oh, each of these characters have their own arc within this larger story. And now, that sort of happened just through the process of revision, of constantly saying, maybe this person needs a beginning, middle, and end too, and giving it to them as best as I possibly could.
So as QTS said, a lot of long division, and you have the book right back there behind you. Uh, so we got a ton of questions about what characters were easier to write, which characters were harder to write. So can you speak to both sides of the easiest and hardest characters to write?
The easiest character to write was Maggie. Maggie, who tends to be a lot of people's favorite character. A lot of readers have told me that they really enjoy Maggie. Maggie was easiest to write because I drew on the matriarchs of my own family in order to create her. So I had the benefit of knowing my great great grandmother, my great grandmother, and all of her sisters, my grandmother, and all of her sisters, and my mother and her sisters. So I got to see several generations of Black women, some of whom carried razor blades in their mouths, some of whom worked the land, built their own houses with their own hands, some of them who did sex work, some who fought men twice their size, some of them who were quiet and prayerful women. So, um, with these wonderful examples of women, and keeping them close in mind, I was able to create a character like Maggie, who actually reminds me of my great aunt Maggie, who the character is named after.
Yeah.
Hardest to write?
Okay.
Paul. Paul was the most difficult character to write, and actually the last character from whose arc I finished, because I had to keep rewriting his chapter so as he didn't come across as like this just two-dimensional monster. I had to keep looking for a reason why he would be like this, and it took me almost the entire 14 years of writing this novel to finally find the reason.
Mm.
Um, so he was the most difficult.
Okay. I want to make a comment about Maggie, but we have several questions because Maggie was a fan favorite for the book club. So I'm going to save my thoughts because they're about, like, the thought I have is about all the women characters in the book. Um, but we were reading alongside this Playing in the Darkness by Toni Morrison. We have two tracks of reading. So we've general and exploration track, which we read over a couple of months. So we've actually been reading Toni. It's a small book, but it's intense. So we've been reading it for like 4 months now. Um, and Toni in the beginning of the book talks about not writing for the white gaze. She also talks about the white literary critic and how that sets the tone for who gets to write and who gets to be read. And it's very clear that you take on a very serious influence from Morrison and write in a very similar vein of writing. So as I read it, I didn't feel like you did a lot of over explaining. There's been books that I've read where I felt like they were writing for a white audience to ensure that the white audience understood the context. And I think you set a very realistic and a very vast, like a very, you do a lot of describing the visual elements and you setting the scene, but you don't do a lot of like trying to overly explain the context. Or explain why things are happening the way they're happening. So, what were you hoping white readers would take from characters like Ruth, Paul, and Timothy?
Um, That's a good question because when I wrote this book, I did not have the white reader in mind. Um, I was writing especially for Black queer people. And that was the reader that I had in mind. So not only was I unconcerned with the white gaze, I was unconcerned with the heterosexist gaze as well. Um, but having had this book out in the world now for about 8 months, I could say that if there's something I want white readers to take from it, particularly those characters, is, do you see yourselves in them? And if so, what can you do to heal that wound? What work must you do to first of all, what work must you do to confront that you might see yourself in these characters, and what is the resolution for the harm you may have caused as a result of being somewhat like these characters, and how do we resolve that? What is the restoration we can make in conjunction with that, and understand how do we strip away all of the awful things that this world has taught us about ourselves and other people, such that we can look at each other as actual people? Maya Angelou said, when she gave that poem for Clinton's inauguration, and she said, you look into your fellow human's eye and say good morning. And that seems like such a simple line, but what she was trying to express is that I see you, and the God in me recognizes the God in you. And so, because of that, I can no longer treat you as though you are nothing. That I know that if what I do to you, I do to me. And so, what I hope they gather is um, that understanding. What I do to you, I do to me, because whiteness makes it difficult to see that.
I definitely thought their characters very much so like Barry Jenkins' rendition of Underground Railroad, the TV series, expressed that whiteness is the violence. And that violence takes on, even within that whiteness, it takes on many different tones. And like, and that these are regular human people, right? So and there's several like scenes that deal with poop or shit rather with the white characters, and they don't even like, you don't do anything to explain the embarrassment that they should have, or the ridiculousness. It really is up to the reader to pick on how they also go about doing these really nasty things. Everyone's talking about white people don't shower, and then they go right back into the bed. Ruth just trampled all through that garden, did some tried to do some next things in the shed. But it's essentially raped the character, then goes into that, but then like steps in shit on the way in, then tramps back through the, like, she's just, and it's like that, and in that it's like sort of, that is what like white power is. It is that sort of aloofness, that trampling through and not caring what you knock over, and then being able to net out a really harsh punishment after, for no reason then because you can. And then Paul, who essentially defecates himself and then is looking at the housewomen to clean him up. And it's just like, you really do leave it to the reader to understand, how embedded this sort of pursuit of power and domination and violence is in them, that they don't even really miss, like, they don't have to sit in their embarrassment. And for the enslaved people on Empty, those sort of actions, they would have, well, as you see with every step they take, there's so much thought about what consequence am I guaranteed to have, and how do I minimize the impact of that consequence. Like for Paul to go to the outhouse and defecate on himself, but then you have Isaiah, you even have Amos, you have several other characters talk about simply trying to cross the threshold into the big house.
Right,
And there's all
right,
this
right.
thought that happens, and the white characters are just like, no, you dumb.
You know
And it's
what
like,
what's so interesting about that scene with Paul going into the outhouse and defecating on himself is, first, he's going into that outhouse and he defecates on himself because Maggie taints his food, makes him sick. And then she and Essie purposely take a long time to get him everything he needs so that he sits in that shit for as long as possible, so that at the end of the chapter, even though he's the one with the power, he feels as though he's been duped, that he's been made a fool of, that they're the ones with the power. because their power is not as showy as Paul's. Theirs comes from the knowing that they're his moral superior. No matter what he does, he's demeaning himself, not them. So that, yeah, I kind of like that scene for that reason.
I thoroughly enjoyed that scene. Um, okay, so let's move on to another hard male character in the book. So a lot of people did not like Amos. Is there really much to love about or like or find good about Amos? Many of us read him as self-serving, patriarchal, in the worst way possible. But is there a lens to examine him through that would give him any grace?
Yes. Um, Amos is a very interesting character for me because Amos is the epitome of what it is to ask a black man to be a protector, a provider. Because that's a double-edged sword. Because when you ask black men to exert power, sort of like how white men do it, so protect me like Paul protects Ruth, that's a problem because that is the wrong example of masculinity or manhood to emulate. And so Amos is the example of what happens when we ask black men to do that. So he thinks in his mind, I'm doing this for the protection of my wife so that Paul will never come to her again. And if I have to throw these two boys under the bus in order to do it, I did my job as a man. I protected my woman. But Amos is that's the conundrum for Amos is he has because he loves Samuel and Isaiah. So he has to destroy them in order to protect somebody else he loves. So that's the horror of white supremacy, the condition that it puts onto black people, what it makes us do, what it makes us choose between, and the dangers of that for not just for those around us, but for us as well.
And
So I have a little bit of sympathy for Amos because he's in an impossible situation. But he's also the example of what happens when you seek power instead of empowerment.
mm, yeah, I think he definitely he's like a embodiment of like patriarchy in the black community. And that black men now wanting to be taking action because they want to be seen as a provider, even though societally, what opportunities for financial stability are they really given? And then, you have all this, and it is true, even in 2021, you see these black male rappers who spend so much time talking about the gay agenda and talking about gay men. And, Little Nas X is causing everybody so much anxiety. And it's like, what does this have to do with you? But it really is that, like, you know the real truth about patriarchy is it does the most damage to black men, even though they are the ones that are the only ones that kind of benefit from it. But to get this small slice of benefit, they end up harming themselves and the whole community in the long run. And it's very much so what Amos does. And it's even more poignant because he's an enslaved person, so there is no guarantee that Paul is going to do any of the things that Amos thinks he can get from him, but there is this aspiration that he can get it. The same way modern day people will aspire to protect billionaires.
That is exactly right.
I mean, he was a character. Okay. You introduce Adam rather late in the book. Like so much, like when I got to Adam's chapter, I was like, "What is happening? So much done going on already, and it's a new character." At this point, like, you think you're getting to, like, well, I feel like the book kind of has peaked. Well, it has, is there like a one point in the book? There's several high points, but you feel like you're kind of getting towards the end of the book, and then Adam arrives, and we get this whole backstory of Adam. um, what drove that decision to introduce him so late in the book? And what is most important for the reader to take from Adam's narrative? I thought there was a parallel to how Paul receives Adam and sort of in return how Amos receives Solomon, who both have the splintering of a cell.
Huh. Very interesting. Um, Adam shows up late. He There's some references to him in Timothy's chapter when Timothy sort of suspects that his father has fathered many children on the plantation. Um, like I think that's like around page 204. But we don't get to meet Adam until late, like you say, because Adam sort of exists on the periphery. He's at home neither with the enslaved nor with the enslavers. He's in this liminal space. And so to convey that sense that he is sort of operating outside of the binary, I introduce him last almost as a jolt to the reader to say, yo, where's this coming from? But he also provides such an interesting understanding of what this thing we call race and how one is raced as a verb um, or adjective. How um, he's he for all intents and purposes can pass for white, except for his telltale mouth because he has big full African lips. And so, what does that mean for him? What does that mean for his place on this plantation? How is he different from the enslaved who don't fully trust him? How is he different from the enslavers who also don't trust him because of the fact that he looks so much like them? And so he sort of comes in as this way to examine um, how ridiculous race is as a construct, but also the ways in which there are all of these things happening on this plantation that are all the way on the edges. And he's one of those edges.
I thought the thing about his as a person with full lips, and like I have a kindergarten picture where I'm like this because I wanted to make, and I wasn't aspiring to be seen as white, but I was just kind of embarrassed by how big my lips were, and there was so much commentary, and
I
as
was
a
told I was told that my full lips were ugly,
yeah.
and so I have so many pictures where my mouth is tucked because I was told my nose was too broad, my forehead was too large, and my lips were too big.
No, it's that, and like so like I when that scene pops up and like it's talking about how he tries to hold his lips in, and when he's sitting at the carriage and the white man comes out to talk to him, I'm like, it's wild because I have never thought about what it would be like to exist in the period of slavery. But the way that we've all kind of still have carried on similar actions of trying to tuck in our mouths and hide our blackness, and how thoroughly anti-blackness is baked into society.
Mm.
Is there actually a parallel between Adam and Solomon in the book?
Um, None that I consciously thought of, but I love that readers are making connections that I might not have done consciously. Um, so I leave that to the reader's interpretation to see if there's a connection there. I did not make one intentionally,
Mm.
but maybe I'll go back and read it to see if there are
Not
parallels
me
in
having
fact
you
there.
go back and read your own work. Uh, okay, so we can finally get into Maggie. So one of the commenters or readers in the community said the women in the novel, Maggie especially, deserve a supporting role Oscar. And
Huh.
you've already kind of answered this about, are there women in your life that the characters are modeled after? Is B Auntie modeled after anybody in your life?
Yes. I won't say who.
Ooh.
But one thing about patriarchy, as Bell Hooks said,
Mm.
it has no gender. Patriarchy is a system in which masculinity and manhood is seen as the most valuable characteristics. Strength, violence, in order to protect, give me this so that I can have all the resources. And anybody could exist with that framework, irrespective of your genitals or your gender identity or your gender. And so while there, while patriarchy does seem like a system that obviously benefits men because economically men make the most money, men have were always entitled to rights first and such. There are some benefits for other people who embody those characteristics. Beanti slash Beulah is someone who succumbs to it, because Beanti doesn't start off as the kind of woman who is, I guess, a patriarchal woman. She's beaten down until she just says, "I give up." She goes from Beulah to Beanti, and as you know, at the end, Beulah returns with a message for Beanti.
Mm.
That I knew that this was not going to save you. You thought that being what they wanted you to be was going to make it easier for you, and look what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So there should be some sympathy for Beanti,
Yeah,
because
that's one of the next questions.
this is what happens to people who face trauma, is that all of us don't it's not surmountable for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
We all of us can't get past the trauma. Some of us are damaged by it, and therefore act out our damage. I see it all the time on social media. We act out our trauma on others. And so I do have a little bit of sympathy for Beanti.
Yeah, the following question is that Auntie Balua stirred a lot of negative feelings. And I asked, well, obviously, you already answered this. Was she meant to represent how patriarchy has no gender? Um, and I did also read that the splintering of her mind was a survival tactic. And again, I was pulling from like Freshwater. In Kweke Emizi's novel, the main character, the Ada, goes through well, at the end it's revealed it was a traumatic experience that caused the splintering of their mind. And out of this comes this really hyper feminine character or spirit that seeks to use the Ada's body to dominate men. And
Mm,
in the process, this kind of knocks down every person. And so I was thinking, that's like a modern splintering of the mind that somehow is protecting the person that spirit lives within. But on the plantation, I like, as much as I didn't care for who Beanti was, Beanti to be that person made a lot of sense.
yeah.
And like there was
Yes.
one of the only like one of the guarantee is that there was always going to be children born on the plantation because that benefits the owner. And that even though they mostly wanted to take in young boys, that there's still this belief of like joy in childhood, even if the women have a negative response to being forced to give birth to children. And trying to take, what character, it's in Gloria Naylor's Women of Rooster Place. There's a
Mm,
character that constantly has children because she likes babies, and
right.
then kind of just, she doesn't discard of them, but she doesn't want to have to raise them once they start talking, and so she just
She
keeps
was
having.
played by she was played by Phyllis Yvonne Stickney in the movie.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
And so Auntie is not literally having the children herself, but it does remind me of this idea like that you're trying to, in a very traumatic experience, you're trying to derive joy from whichever angle you can get. And what joy is there really to be had on Empty for the enslaved people, for the black people? And so that Auntie even reaches for it, maybe there's some nobility in her actions. She
Please,
tried.
I will I want readers to um sort of wrestle with characters like Beanti, and not just say, "Oh, she's a villain, she's a terrible person," because you have to really understand slavery as a mind altering experience. She's trying to survive it, um, by doing some things that are, from our privileged perspective, we can say are untoward. But what would we do under those circumstances? What do we do under current circumstances? Some
Hmm.
of us do these sorts of things now. So,
I feel like there are plenty of women on the block who try to feed into the matriarchal role, even though they don't actually like children.
mm,
Because for some women that's
mm,
the only option. I mean, I thought of a lot of the women in this book really gave I brought to mind Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Garden, which is a book we read this on our exploration track. And so the title essay talks about thinking about our mothers and grandmothers as artists who were never allowed to be artists. Like they didn't get to
Mm.
live like the white women and go painting on the lake under the cherry tree. You know, they were used for their labor. And so how did their art is expressed in their survival. There you have to kind of dig deeper to see the talent that they held that they weren't really allowed to express.
My grandmother is a perfect example of that. God rest her soul. My grandmother Corrine was a seamstress who could whip together anything out of any materials, but she worked a factory, and it turned her art into this arduous labor to which it demeaned her artistic spirit, and she died not being able to realize just how brilliant she actually was.
Mm. And I think and many of us, if we've ever gotten the opportunity to know our elder ancestors, can look at women in our family who because they grew up, you know, my I grew up with my great grandmother who was born in 1904 in Harlem, and she just was not a matriarchal person at all. But she had a really traumatic experience. She also grew up in an era of eugenics, and they took her uterus out after my grandmother was born. And so her
Mercy.
response to mothering, or her disdain for mothering, was rooted in not even having control over her own body. And then
Right.
also, what does it mean to, like, at the time she was married, but her husband like just disappeared into east. You know, it was very easy to disappear in the 1920s, and he did it. And so, what sort of, you know, if we have shame in 2021, or women have shame of being single mothers, what does it mean to be in 1925, you know, during the Harlem Renaissance in New York, and to be a single mother at 21, 22, in an era of scarcity on top of it? Like, I don't, do we really understand what our elders put up with in order to survive? And as
Right.
Hortense
That's
Spiller
right.
says, we have so much distance, even in vernacular, from the plantation, that can we ever really understand the weight of what it meant to be an enslaved person?
Mm, mm, mm.
I have one more question about the auntie. How can the reader trouble themselves on the sympathy they may have for Sarah versus their disgust with the auntie?
That is a great question. Um, the reader should consider that perhaps at one point, Auntie was Sarah, the Sarah who wasn't as strong and so succumbed to the onslaught. Whereas Sarah resisted it, maybe her queerness helped her to resist it. Beyonce did not have queerness as a sort of tool in her shed to help her navigate. She was in love with the wielders of patriarchy, and so she had to find a way to both stay alive and love. And so that tension broke her. And so I would ask the reader, while Sarah is one of my favorite characters too, because I enjoy her zero fuckedness. Um, I I caution the reader to in trying to put her on this pedestal, because there is a danger in strength too. When we start to think of Black women or people in general as only strength,
Mm-hmm.
we then feel like we can lump anything onto them and that they will never break. So I would caution the reader in
Yeah.
that sense.
Thank you. All right, so back to Maggie, the fan favorite. Maggie was so tied to ancestral roots and practices. And actually, I probably should give a spoiler alert. You might want to mute us for the next 2 minutes if you have not got to the ending of the book, because this is an ending of the book spoiler. So her ties to ancestral roots and practices seems contradictory for her to not let Samuel know his true heritage. Can she reconcile the two?
No, she cannot, because what made Maggie the Maggie that can't stand children is the same thing that made her not tell Samuel what his true heritage was. She had to operate in a space where I cannot love any other thing because it's going to be snatched from me. So the more that I could work up myself in despising these other things, the better off I am. That way, when they take it from me, it'd be like they were taking a piece of clothing off of me.
Mhm.
I could just replace it with another or what have you. So her cognitive dissonance is at once profound love, which she is deeply she's hidden so deeply that she can't even recognize it when it happens, and two, um, realizing that she can't love anything unless it be snatched from her and she be shattered, and that cannot be reconciled.
It definitely gave Beloved and Setha daring to be a mother. Right, because there is a scene where she essentially kills her child, or attempts to kill all her children because she doesn't want them taken from her, because she
Right.
took that huge risk of daring to be a mother. What does it mean?
With intention.
Yeah, what does it mean to be somebody's son, somebody's daughter, to be somebody's something?
Right.
Oh, especially on Empty. And I guess maybe that's why Amos goes so hard for Ruth. That or not Ruth, for Essie.
Essie.
That, the idea that he could have that, somebody was his something. And that was something that most of them weren't allowed to have.
A woman that he actually chose and who chose him.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that choice, like, that's such a flirtation with autonomy. How could he give that up? How could he let anything happen to that, even if he has to destroy two boys he loves? How could he let anything happen to that?
But why, if he understands the value of autonomy, would he not allow Samuel and Isaiah to have that little bit of autonomy that wasn't bothering nobody?
Because human beings are selfish.
Mm-hmm.
We want, you go to any internet space, any social media space, accountability is always for other people. It's never for us. Autonomy and consent is always for us, never for other people. When we talk about these concepts, we mean me. We don't mean us. And so Amos is one of those people. He's a me. What about me and my autonomy and my love? Fuck yours.
Mm.
I got a taste of this one, and so I want it for me at whatever cost.
Yes. Whew. Your writing of Empty and the black people, this is my question. This is not community. This was me. I wanted to
Okay.
know with your writing of Empty and the black people that exist on the plantation, it really made me think of grief. Because the only thing that is ensured to the black people there was death.
Mm.
And so it felt like the characters were kind of going through the grieving process for their entire existence and just trying to manage through that grieving process. And then I started to think, can we potentially look at generational trauma as akin to the grieving process? Like grief never leaves you. Um, it does you it manifests. It is up to you to decide how you turn that around.
Well, if you believe in the epigenetics movement, where scientists are beginning to see that we actually pass trauma on as a physical attribute, as a biological attribute, then yes, grief is passed on from generation to generation to generation. And the cycle is only broken when we recognize it in ourselves and say, well, what I'm going to do is use it in a way that's useful, in a way that's enlightening, illuminating, elevating, so that this next baby creature that I'm bringing into this world will not have that burden. Or if I do somehow pass that burden on, I can pass it on in a way that is more manageable for them than it was for me. But I don't think many of us, first of all, acknowledge the fact that these traumas are housed within our souls, within our cells, um, or that we're passing it on to our charges, the responsibility we have for raising these children who are not ours, but whom we are responsible for. And so, um, yes, I believe that grief is passed on. I still mourn the death of my grandmother, Corrine, who died when I was 7 years old.
Mhm.
I'm 50, and I'm still grieving her death. Um, and I will grieve her death until the day I die. But the way in which I honor her memory is in trying to be the best writer I possibly can in her name. And so I think we should try to be our best selves in the name of that grief.
Yes. Yes, I entirely agree. How are you hoping for the reader to understand Samuel and Isaiah's ending and the point of view that Isaiah offers in the closing?
Well, so my mother says at the end of this book that Isaiah is recaptured by the enslavers.
Okay.
My sister says, no, actually, that's wrong. My sister said that. My sister
Mm-hmm.
said Isaiah is captured by the enslavers. My mother said Pua finds him and they run off together. Um, my cousin says the indigenous people find him and rescue him.
Mm.
And another of my cousins says that the ancestors made themselves manifest and brought Isaiah into their bosom.
Yes.
All of those are the right answer.
Okay.
I want the reader to bring, this is how the reader brings themselves into the work. You're telling me so much about yourself by telling me how you interpreted that ending.
Mm-hmm.
In my head, I know what the ending is.
Okay.
I actually I I actually have I actually have a version of the manuscript where the ending is clear and spelled out in a way that is not ambiguous. So I know what happens to Isaiah, but I wanted the ending to be a bit more ambiguous so that the reader, um, that we are in conversation with this work as opposed to me just like dictating these ideas and these thoughts to you.
Okay. Okay. We'll have to have another live discussion where people can all tell us how they thought the book ended. So the last question we have is that the prophets offers a very rare glimpse of vulnerability, compassion, and tenderness between Black male characters. I think you kind of touched on this, but were there any other books that provided inspiration for telling this kind of love story? And any recommendations you would have for readers who would like to read more of these types of love stories?
Um, James Baldwin's "Go Tell It on the Mountain"
Okay.
was the basis for Samuel and Isaiah. Um, his two characters, John and Elisha, who flirt around the edges with their attraction to one another, who have this deep spiritual connection, but who never consummate their relationship. But there was something still so divine about that innocent introduction to love. That was the inspiration for Samuel and Isaiah. In terms of what other works I would recommend, there's so few where Black men get to be vulnerable, soft, caring, weak, because the world despises nothing more than a weak Black man. Black men
Mm-hmm.
have to be strong or they're not men. That is the world. That's what the entire world says, including Black men. Um, but I would look at Black Leopard, Red Wolf by
Okay.
Marlon James. That has some really complex understandings of manhood and masculinity and relationships between men. Um, and I would probably also look at Randall Keenan's work. He did Rest His Soul. He did some really good investigations of the Black male figure and sort of queered it in a lot of ways. And in terms of theory, I would probably look at people like Marlon Riggs and Joseph Beam, who talked about breaking down this patriarchal understanding of Black manhood.
Okay, we might have to get into some of those theory reads later on in the book club. So we're at time. There's so many more questions we could ask because this was such a lovely, vivid read. There are so many comments in the live chat. People discussing how much they enjoyed this book and they felt like they were tasting sounds and hearing colors.
Um,
I mean, when we did the live discussion with David Johns, he was saying he cannot. He just feels like this absolutely has to be put on film. We need to see this visually.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, we're very, we're hoping we will be there right there with you because this was such an enjoyable read. I loved, and I just loved the discussions we were even able to have. These are some of my favorite discussions, and being able to bring in Paris and David and Jared to discuss the book, and really like both trouble ourselves and expand our viewpoints, and taking all the love and compassion. And I so enjoyed just how tender and compassionate Samuel and Isaiah were with each other. And that really is such a rare literary experience. So I really appreciate all the time and labor and integrity you put into this work. And thank you for joining us. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Smart Brown Girls Book Club, you are outstanding
Oh,
and you
thank
do
you.
such a service to our community. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. The syllabus, it was CJ and Nicole who put together the syllabus. We would not be here without the cohort who does so much work for us behind the scenes. So thank you. Everyone have a good night. Bye.